Karg, 20 miles off Iran's coast, is Tehran's most strategic economic asset. With its major oil storage facilities and ports, it is the launch point for 90% of the country's oil exports. In mid-March,
Reminder, some 20 million barrels of fuel a day move through this critical shipping route, and it is clearly effectively remains shut down because of this very real threat.
At 3:12, 22 nautical miles east of Keshem Island, a U.S. carrier group was crossing the Strait of Hormuz when 42 IRGC fast boats closed around its outer screen. Inside the carrier, 5,600 sailors were awake. The objective was simple: break the ring before the boats reached visual intimidation range and before Tehran's coastal command could turn a standoff into a headline. They had 31 minutes. A second clock was worse. 19 minutes before reinforcements from Bandar Abbas entered the picture. They thought it couldn't be taken. They were wrong. The first warning did not come from radar. It came from silence. At 3:13, the normal chatter between civilian tankers, escort vessels, and port control thinned into something too clean, too controlled, too staged. Outside, the carrier's deck lights were low against the black water. Inside, a watch officer stared at 42 contacts, moving with a discipline nobody wanted to say out loud. The numbers didn't match. 2 hours earlier, the intelligence board showed 38 boats available in the sector. Now there were 42. 4 were missing from every report, every intercept, every satellite pass, and that was the first open loop nobody could close. What they didn't know was that those 4 extra boats were not reinforcements. They were carrying something else. At 3:15, the carrier group shifted posture, but not in panic. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest shipping lane, and every mile there is watched by someone. Coastal sensors near Bandar Abbas, patrol stations along Keshem, commercial observers near Larak, and intelligence crews pretending to be fishermen. This wasn't open ocean. It was a hallway with cameras on both walls. The IRGC boats believed that mattered. They believed the carrier could be surrounded without being touched, embarrassed without being attacked, filmed without triggering a response. That was the mistake. At 3:17, the primary clock started 31 minutes. Not because the Americans chose that number, but because after 31 minutes, the geometry of the strait would change. A tanker convoy from the Gulf of Oman was approaching from the southeast. 2 cargo vessels were tracking west, and a civilian communications shadow would soon cover the channel with enough confusion to hide almost anything. The problem wasn't the 42 boats. The problem was what they could disappear behind. Inside the Combat Information Center, the first mismatch became the second. The boats were not moving like a swarm. No, they were moving like a screen. They weren't there for a collision. They were there for concealment. Now, if you want to see what those 4 missing boats were hiding, hit right now, because this is where the mission stopped being defensive. At 3:19, the carrier commander received the first classified fragment from Task Cell Meridian, a fictional joint maritime intelligence unit that had been tracking IRGC activity for 9 days. The fragment was short: 4 hulls, false signatures, possible transfer package. No one in the room spoke for 3 seconds, because that meant the visible threat was not the real threat. They weren't there for the carrier, they were there for the handoff. Across the water near Larak Island, the 42 boats tightened their crescent. Their crews believed speed was protection, they believed proximity was leverage. They believed the Americans would hesitate because every camera in the Gulf would be watching. What they didn't know was that the carrier group had already separated the picture into 2 wars. One war was visible, the other was underneath the noise. At 3:21, a secondary timer appeared on the center display, 17 minutes until coastal reinforcement. The watch floor went quiet again, not afraid, focused. Outside, the first IRGC line pushed closer, cutting across black water with white wakes. At the same time, 2 American escort ships adjusted position without dramatic turns, without radio theatrics, without giving the boats the moment they wanted. This wasn't a chase, it was a squeeze. The real target was deeper. It was not the first ring of boats, it was the hidden command link behind them. By 3:23, a surveillance feed caught a flash near the stern of one of the extra 4 boats. Not a weapon launch, not a boarding ladder. A sealed gray case, strapped beneath a tarp, passed from one crewman to another before vanishing into the deck shadow. That was the artifact. a waterproof courier case marked with a code that did not belong to any normal patrol unit. The numbers didn't match because the mission wasn't normal. This was not a harassment run. It was a courier operation disguised as a confrontation. Comment 42 if you think the swarm was never meant to win the fight, only to hide the transfer. At 3:24, the boats began broadcasting. Short clips, angled footage, carrier silhouette in the background, IRGC flags snapping in the dark. The whole performance was designed for one purpose: make the world see the carrier surrounded before anyone understood what was really happening. They weren't there for victory. They were there for the picture. Inside the carrier, analysts from the fictional Gulf Maritime Fusion Desk compared the live formation with old footage from Abu Musa, Jask, and Bandar Abbas. The pattern appeared for half a second, then disappeared. A 4-boat pocket always stayed shielded from the carrier's direct line of sight. Every turn protected it. Every noisy boat served it. At 3:26, the mid-script twist arrived early, and it hit hard. One of the 42 boats was not crewed the way it should have been. Thermal readings showed too few bodies. The deck profile was wrong. The engine signature was too clean. What they didn't know was that the boat everyone thought was a decoy was actually the control node. The target wasn't where it was supposed to be. The courier case was bait. The command package was moving separately. For the first time, the watch officers stopped counting boats and started counting gaps. Outside, the water tightened. The IRGC line surged, then slowed, then surged again. Resistance came in waves, not bullets. Noise, pressure, threat angles, forced hesitation. But every minute they spent performing burned their own clock. At 3:28, the secondary timer dropped to 12 minutes. Reinforcements from Bandar Abbas were no longer a possibility on a planning board. They were a moving problem. The carrier group had to end the encounter before the second force arrived, before the footage left the strait, before the hidden node could dump its payload into the network. This wasn't about sinking boats, it was about erasing the operation. Not captured, not reclaimed, gone. At 3:29, the first boat broke from the outer ring, then 3 more, then 7. They appeared to be charging, but the movement was too broad, too theatrical. At the same time, the 4 protected hulls shifted inward toward the center of the swarm. That was the mistake. They compressed their own formation. They turned a scattered problem into a single decision. The response came fast, overwhelming, and deliberately undescribed. No step-by-step, no clean diagram. Just flashes over the water, hard turns in the dark, sudden engine failures, and 42 crews realizing at nearly the same second that the carrier group had never been trapped. It had been waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. Type yes if you would have spotted the hidden node before the swarm closed in. At 3:31, the first 5 boats were disabled. By 3:33, the number was 11. The radio channels filled with clipped calls, overlapping alarms, and commands that no longer sounded confident. Outside, the boats that had been filming now tried to turn away. But the formation they built to surround the carrier had become a cage around themselves. This wasn't a retreat, it was a collapse. At 3:34, one of the protected 4 attempted to break east toward Keshem Island. At the same time, another turned south, trying to blend with commercial traffic. Underground, in a fictional coastal command bunker near Bandar Abbas, controllers watched their clean maritime picture fracture into dozens of blinking warnings. What they didn't know was that the Americans were not chasing every boat. They were isolating the one that mattered. The problem wasn't the swarm, the problem was the server module inside the control node. At 3:36, the high-value reveal came. The control boat went dead in the water, not destroyed, stopped. A small fire burned near its stern, and when the crew tried to throw a black case overboard, the lid burst open against the rail. Inside was not cash, not documents, not a propaganda camera. It was a hardened server core packed inside a salt-stained shock vault, its casing marked with 3 inventory codes that matched earlier seizures near Jask and Abu Musa. The real target had been floating in the middle of the swarm the entire time. They weren't there for the carrier. They were there to test a maritime kill chain recorder. At 3:37, the room understood why the IRGC needed the footage. The boats were not simply surrounding the carrier for propaganda, they were measuring response time, distance, formation shifts, escort behavior, and communications rhythm. Every second of American movement was being harvested. Every hesitation Was data every angle? Was a rehearsal? That wasn't the real objective. The real objective was to build a playbook for the next confrontation. Share this because the scariest weapon in the Strait wasn't a missile, it was the data they were trying to steal. At 3:39, the secondary timer hit 7 minutes. Reinforcements were close enough to matter. The carrier group had one choice left: end the visible fight and deny the invisible one. Outside, the swarm broke apart. Some boats drifted powerless, some burned low against the waterline. Some circled without coordination, their radios jammed by fear more than technology. The control node remained trapped between two fields of black water and white wake. Inside its shock vault, the server module kept trying to wipe itself. 22 minutes earlier, nobody even knew it existed. Now it was the center of the entire night. The wipe would complete in 4 minutes. The mission window had 8, 2 timers, 1 decision. At 3:41, the courier case from the earlier boat was recovered from the water, cracked at one corner but sealed. Inside was a binder wrapped in oilskin, stamped with a fictional designation, Project Saffron Ledger. That was the custody moment, not a trophy, not a souvenir, evidence. The binder linked the 42 boats to 3 coastal rehearsals, 6 signal tests, and 1 planned media release scheduled for 4:10. The headline had already been written before the boats arrived. U.S. carrier surrounded in Hormuz. That was what they wanted the world to see. But by then, the story had changed. At 3:43, the wipe timer hit 2 minutes. Inside the server core, hidden storage began fragmenting itself. Analysts later said only 18% of the module was recovered cleanly, but that 18% was enough. Enough to show the command routes, enough to show the rehearsal schedule, enough to show why 4 boats were missing from the original count. They had never been assigned to the swarm list. They had been assigned to the data package. What they didn't know was that the missing 4 were the only boats the carrier group truly cared about. At 03:44, the IRGC reinforcement line slowed, not because it was blocked, because there was nothing left to reinforce. The first ring was gone as an organized force. The second ring never formed. The propaganda footage never became the story they wanted, not captured, not reclaimed, gone. By 3:46, 31 boats were disabled or abandoned. By 3:47, 38 were out of the fight. At 3:48, the final 4 were boxed into still water, their engines dead, their formation broken, their purpose exposed. 31 minutes after the first clock started, the last hostile boat stopped transmitting. 42 surrounded the carrier. 42 failed. The final numbers were colder than the footage. Friendly casualties, 0 killed, 2 injured in shipboard accidents during the high-speed alert cycle. Enemy losses, 42 boats neutralized as an organized force, with confirmed fatalities never publicly acknowledged, and surviving crews scattered across disabled hulls. Time on ground, from first hostile closure to final silence, 31 minutes. Strategic impact, a maritime intimidation operation collapsed, a hidden data harvesting network was exposed, and the next planned confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz was delayed by months. Estimated cost, over $180 million in boats, electronics, command systems, lost intelligence architecture, and failed propaganda value. What they miscalculated was not American firepower. They miscalculated patience. They believed surrounding a carrier meant controlling the story. But the carrier group did not chase the loudest boats. It waited for the quietest one, and when the hidden server, the Saffron Ledger binder, and the 4 missing hulls finally connected, the truth was simple. They weren't there for a battle, they were there for a recording. And this wasn't a victory parade, it was a failed theft. If you want the next breakdown on what was inside the Saffron Ledger, hit like right now. Comment Hormuz if you think the real war at sea is being fought with data, not boats.